Peace, salam. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and you're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, Apple TV, and always we're there 24/7 on muslimnetwork.tv. It was 75 years ago this month when America bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And a whole lot of people, cities were wiped out, whole lot of people died. No one is sure how many, but people put numbers to 250,000 or so, lower and higher. When I came to the US 40 years ago, very initial days of my school at the University of Chicago, professor after professor will brag about, more or less, about University of Chicago is the place where the nuclear era began. But I had no idea that the library I sat for days after days, months after months, Regenstein Library, right beneath that was where human being achieved something which they call, what is that vocabulary? Sustained, controlled chain reaction, something like that. I visited Hiroshima, visited its museum, and saw how X-rays had depicted a whole human being on a concrete block. Saw the devastation and also that dome, which was just still there in the same shape it was left. And I kept wondering, when world will know what it takes to do these type of things? That still at the University of Chicago, there is monument, one can call it a skull shape or the shape of a overland smoke and whatever is left after the detonation of a bomb. There was a time when anti-nuclear processions will begin from there. But that is no longer the case. Sometime tourist buses will stop there, look at it, but it's no longer a center of activism. Is the world still concerned about the nuclear bomb? Have people forgotten the lessons? What were the lessons which we should have learned and what we have forgotten about it? And there is so much secrecy about it. What are the secrets there? And someone who is very thorough in paying attention to that is our guest today to talk about it, Alex Werstein. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
I'm very happy to be here, Imam Mujahid.
Professor Alex Werstein is a historian, a professor, and director of the Science and Technology Studies program at Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. He considered himself, quote unquote, a dedicated archive-rat. Well, I wish he can train a whole lot of rats to deliver what he delivers about nuclear secrets. Alex is about to publish a book on the history of nuclear secrecy in the United States. Alex, thank you so much for your amazing, thorough work which you do. Reading your articles, I could see documentaries in the making there. That some documentary makers should be interested in taking one subject matter and going through it, whether it is your recent article about nobody knows how many people actually died in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, or a professor losing nuclear secrets about papers in the train. That will be a very suspense type of a documentary. Or it is if all the 40,000 fire bombs, napalm bombs we threw at the Japan, if that was done to the US, what will it be? I hope some of your students are inspired enough to take it to the documentary level, because unfortunately, we don't read much, do we?
One of the things, and since you brought it up, one of the problems we have in thinking about these bombings is that much of our documentaries and our television shows and even books, they go over the same questions and the same episodes again and again and again. And there's so much more out there. There's different questions to ask. There's different episodes to look at, all of which sort of not only teach you something new, but can teach you more about those original questions you had in the first place. So I share with you the desire that some of these kinds of topics, there's so much out there that hasn't been really talked about.
I especially like that, the data mapping thing, which you have done, taking the data of Japan and 40,000 napalm bombs, which are way before the atomic bomb, and overlaying in the US population and what it will do. I hope somewhere, some good teacher is using your material in the classroom to talk about it. You wrote one recent article about no one can stop President Trump from using nuclear weapons. That is by design. What is that design?
Starting actually 75 years ago today, on August 10th, 1945, President Truman established the system first in a very ad hoc way, but later it was formalized that only the United States president can order the use of nuclear weapons in the United States, which is to say, not the military, not the Secretary of Defense, nobody else. And when Truman did this in the 1940s, the idea was that only the president was responsible enough, really, to take on that kind of decision. Today, that same system has made a lot of people very uncomfortable because they fear that the president is perhaps not responsible enough, or any one person is not responsible enough to have all that power. It not only gives the president the power to order the use of nuclear weapons, it makes it so that nobody else is supposed to have the ability to say no to that order either. So in principle, with some very narrow exceptions, if President Trump decided today that he wanted to use nuclear weapons, the military would be legally required to go through with that. Now, there are some ways in which they could try to delay it, or there are some criteria under which they could say we won't follow this order because it violates the laws of war, something like that. Or you could imagine everybody trying to get together and use the 25th Amendment to remove the president or something like that. But that's not how the system is designed. The design of the system is to make it a very smooth transition from president gives an order to nuclear weapons are used. And that's been the system we've had since the 1940s.
So has there been conversation to enhance the system in a way that responsibility is more thoughtfully executed?
Within the United States, there have been occasional moments in which this has come up. So it came up at the end of the Nixon administration, for example, and people have had this conversation even in Congress today with the Trump administration. But I haven't heard of any accounts throughout this entire history where people in, say, the White House were having this conversation, or where people in the military were having this conversation. And these discussions so far have not gone anywhere. They've led to an occasional law that has been proposed that would say something like the president can't use nuclear weapons first, which doesn't quite answer it, but maybe lessens some of those fears, right? Or there have been some that have said the president would need Congress to use nuclear weapons. Those haven't gone anywhere. So the conversations have mostly been on the outside. When I've talked to people who are connected to the inside, and I've listened to them speak, and I've had some interactions with military officials, they are generally horrified at the idea that you would somehow add additional people into that conversation, because what they're worried about, number one, is that maybe the president wouldn't be able to respond quickly, they aren't, to them, even asking the question of, is the president reliable? To them, that sounds like a question you're not supposed to ask. And so they're not pushing this from what I can see.
Has anyone, I mean, we know we have the division of powers. There is a Congress, there is administration, there is judiciary. Has there been any move? I mean, you mentioned the White House never have deliberated on it. There has not been any record of any conversation on this issue. But do you think, these, three pillars of our democracy sometime have an opinion and, extend their power by exerting it? Has Congress ever deliberated on this particular issue, to your knowledge?
Congress has.
Through a resolution or a bill which has been presented?
They've had bills and they've had hearings on this question, but they've never gone anywhere. They've never gotten more than being proposed. They never voted on anything like this, to my knowledge. There are tricky constitutional issues. Congress, in theory, is the only body that is allowed to declare war, but the president is meant to be the commander-in-chief. And so this has been a problem not just related to nuclear. The United States has not declared war on anybody for a long time, but we've gone to war several times because we have emergency powers, and we don't call it a war anymore, and all sorts of complicated things like that. You could make the argument, and the people in favor of Congress having a bigger role have made this argument, that what could be unambiguously less like a declaration of war than the use of a nuclear weapon? If you launch a nuclear weapon at somebody, how is that not an act of war? How could you not consider that to be under Congress's purview? On the other hand, you have people who argue that as the commander-in-chief, this is just ordering the armed forces to do something, and that is unambiguously the power of the president. The courts have not really ruled on these issues in a strong way. And so this is one of those areas where it's not completely clear how they would rule. You could imagine there are members of the Supreme Court, for example, who are very much in favor of the power of the president, and they would push towards perhaps that answer. And then there are those who would maybe push the other direction as well, but it's not resolved and it's not unambiguous. If I were making a recommendation to Congress, it would be to find some way to state their preference. Whether or not they believed it was going to be binding or not, it might have an impact on the military officers who are required to actually execute the order. So if Congress passed a law that said no order can be considered legal unless the Secretary of Defense says it's okay, or unless Congress approves, whatever it might be, the president might object to that. But the military might use that as a question of whether or not they could defy the order or not.
So that raises, so if so much reliance is on our president, and we trust our democracy, electoral democracy, somebody get elected, but that person is individual. That person is subject to all the human strengths and weaknesses. I mean, we have tens of thousands of people committing suicide, right? And then we have tens of thousands of people committing murder. So they have some type of disbalance in a way to hurt themselves and hurt others. And then we have institutions which interfere to mediate those tendencies when a person might be able to help hurt themselves or hurt other people. And with such a huge thing like atomic bomb or hydrogen bomb, and you have written a lot about secrecy. I don't know what other types of bombs are there. So when we come back after this short break, I'd like to ask you a question about that, the alarm which went off in Hawaii, that a missile on the way of Hawaii and take a shelter, and it was in a human error. What about if that information has reached somewhere that this missile actually is a nuclear bomb, and to prevent that, somebody goes in a preventive mode of offense? I mean, let's take a short break. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Professor Alex Wellstein, and we'll be right back after these messages.
what was it like when you started this network out, when you started Sound Vision those many years ago?
After 9/11, one lady called me and she says, what is your channel which I can watch? And I say, I'm sorry, we don't have a channel. And you know what she said? She said, then how America will know about you?
SubhanAllah. Anything you want to say to the people who are watching? We had one sister who messaged that she grew up on Sound Vision. What do you say to the people who have been long supporters?
Thank you. Thank you. It is because of you we are able to do all of that. So the generation of Adam's world, you need to take it over for the next generation. And that's my invitation to you. So keep telling everybody where to watch. They can watch it on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, or easy thing, muslimnetwork.tv, or our YouTube channel, or our Facebook channel. And with your help, inshallah, ladies, the one who called me, what channel should I watch Muslims on? Answer is here and now. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Professor Alex Wellerstein. And so the question which I have is that alert which went on in Hawaii, the ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, quote unquote, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill, unquote. And I think you write in your article that, a correction was not issued for 38 seconds, or was it 38 minutes?
Minutes.
Minutes?
Yeah.
Wow. So does ballistic missile always mean a nuclear bomb?
It doesn't have to always mean a nuclear bomb, but in practice, it probably means a nuclear bomb. They're not, especially if it's coming from North Korea. There's not much benefit for them to shoot a ballistic missile if it doesn't have a nuclear bomb on the end of it, because it's probably not accurate enough to do anything else.
So most likely somebody is putting that much power to do something which could be mistaken as a nuclear bomb. It probably will be a nuclear bomb. What the reaction to the Hawaii's false alert was in the US? Was anywhere the nuclear people who are watching from Israel, were they alerted? Were they ready to react? How much time it took for president to be informed? What decision president took on that? What is your information based on that?
So in this case, the alert was sent out by the agency in Hawaii, the state. So it wasn't sent by the military or the federal government. And so the military and the federal government would have known that this wasn't correct, because if the way it is supposed to go is the federal government would tell Hawaii that the missile was inbound, and then the alert would go out if it was going to happen. Hawaii doesn't have its own independent detection of this. So on the one hand, you wouldn't have any risk of the military thinking that it was a missile. They would easily be able to call up their people and say, no, we didn't send that message. There's nothing on the screen. There does, and this gets back to your comment before the break, the big worry you would have in this is if you have a president who is not trusting of intelligence agencies, who is not trusting of who is not paying attention to his own government, but is spending all of his time watching television or perhaps on Twitter or something like that, you could imagine them getting incorrect information and acting poorly upon it. Now, fortunately, the odds of even a very inattentive president getting this particular message and doing anything devastating with it other than sending out their own tweet seems pretty low, in the sense that they would have to go through the people who would have access to that information. So if the president did call up the people who can use nuclear weapons, Strategic Command, and said, I've heard this is happening, Strategic Command has access to the information to say it's not happening. And so they would probably reassure him that that was not the case. You could imagine, though, a lot of other miscommunications. Imagine that happens. And then the president tweets something like, we're going to nuke North Koreans from the face of the earth. And then the North Koreans read that tweet and think that this whole thing is an elaborate excuse for the United States to attack them. And then they actually do launch a ballistic missile. You could imagine situations with this rapid communication and this high potential for miscommunication. You could imagine a lot of things going wrong. In the case of the Hawaii case, by the way, it's not clear if it was an accident or something that a disgruntled employee did. And I find it really interesting that it's been now well over a year since that happened. 2 years, I think now, right? Something like that. And we still don't 100% know exactly how it went wrong.
Also, the information which you mentioned that the employee, instead of test alert, he pushed the live alert. He selected the live alert thing was the mistake. That is not certain why he did that. Was it a human mistake, a real honest one, or he did it intentionally? That is the only portion which is unknown, right?
That is even as of yet unknown. And the employee has his version of the story, which is he was told information and he clicked it and this. But the Hawaiian officials have implied at times that it's a different direction. I went to Hawaii about a year afterwards and talked with a number of people, and it was still remarkable that nobody really exactly knew. They knew that their system clearly wasn't set up correctly if one person could do all of this, because that's this gets us back to the presidential use of nuclear weapons thing. It's easy for one person to make a mistake or to have a bad idea or to, who knows? People are complicated. It's much harder for two people, which is why it's somewhat can be disturbing that so much power in the case of the actual use of the nuclear weapons themselves are in the hands of one person.
So the human error, would you say, is the major variable in the world going into nuclear warfare?
I think the human variable is the biggest unknown. They have a lot of systems that are set up so that once you make the system go ahead, it'll go. And the people who are in charge of, say, turning the keys to actually launch the missiles, they're drilled over and over and over again. If they get an order, they'll do it. They're not going to sit around and ask questions. They're not going to have deep philosophical considerations. They have been selected for that job because they are going to turn that key, and then they practice turning the key every day. They do it. They practice so that if it comes in, it's automatic. The only place in that whole system that isn't really automatic is the very top. So now you're getting into, let's imagine a situation. A missile is incoming, or a terrorist has set off a nuclear weapon, or who knows, right? Some situation. What will the president do? You can't actually answer that because it's up to that person at that moment. And all of the people we're talking about, who knows what they are today? Even people who are much more predictable than Trump. If you're not in that situation, how can you know what you'll do? It's not a regular situation. It's a totally extraordinary moment. Would that mean that you would launch all of them back? Would that mean that you would wait and see what happened? Would that mean that you found out it was nuclear, but you didn't respond with nuclear because you thought it was too many dead and you're going to respond some other way? Who knows? If it's up to an individual person, you're subjected to everything in their individual past, into their belief system, into their biology that day. Are they on medication? These are things that we know from past presidents have been a major issue. President Kennedy was on a lot of painkillers for most of his presidency. Nixon drank a lot at the end of his presidency. Ronald Reagan was going through Alzheimer's at the end of his presidency. I'm sure if you look into any president, you'll find exactly the same kinds of problems that you will see in every person at different stages of their life, especially under high stress. So this is the part which for me is the real unknown variable. If the president makes a decision about what to do, you can probably guess what the consequences will be, because those systems are pretty systematic. They're robust.
So if the threat has been made direct or indirect about North Korea and Iran, and probably Afghanistan also. So if suppose we use some atomic bomb in any of these countries, these atomic bombs which we're going to use are not those which were used in Hiroshima Nagasaki, right? What is the lowest level of atomic bomb at this moment as compared to Hiroshima Nagasaki?
So the smallest atomic bombs that the United States currently has are probably around 300 tons of TNT. So that's about, to put it in perspective, that's perhaps something like the Beirut explosion that happened last week. We don't know exactly how big that was, but that's one of the estimates. It's several hundred tons of TNT. So that's a fairly large explosion by human standards. But compared to the Hiroshima atomic bomb, the Hiroshima atomic bomb is 15,000 tons of TNT. So that's 5 times more than that. Did I get my math right? Yeah, something like that. No, excuse me, that's 50 times more.
Yeah. So what will be the impact of that? So if it happens on North Korea, Afghanistan, of course, doesn't have anything like that, but North Korea, Iran have nuclear technology or nuclear bomb. We don't know exactly. What do you see? Say America has bombed North Korea or Iran today. What do you expect happening?
So those little bombs are mainly supposed to be used against tanks. They're not even really supposed to be, maybe a bunker underground. The ones that we would use on North Korea are probably much larger than that. They are probably our regular missiles, which are more like 200 kilotons, which is to say 10 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. So there's a lot of options available. And this is, again, where things are unpredictable. If there was a crisis where somebody thought nuclear weapons might be used, or the president asked for nuclear weapons to be used, he'd be given like a menu. It would be something like, would you like to use these little tiny bombs, but that will take 2 days? Or would you like to use this much bigger bomb that could be launched in 10 minutes? These kinds of options would be made available. And which one he would choose, we don't know. An advisor might try to steer him towards one option or the other, but it's ultimately up to the president. In terms of what the impact would be, it would depend on basically 3 things. One, how large is the bomb? And again, they can vary from maybe 300 tons of TNT to our very largest bombs are over 1 million tons of TNT. So that's a very large gap between the largest and the smallest in our current arsenal. Where are you dropping it? Are you launching it at a city? Or are you trying to destroy some underground centrifuge facility or something like that? I don't find it incredibly likely that the United States, that the military would go along with launching at a city if it was, say, Iran, only because this would be a real problem with laws of war. It's the kind of thing they could actually say no to. The proportionality of it would be a lot of death for whatever you'd get from it. And it would require sort of extraordinary circumstances for them to think about that, but it's not impossible. But I don't worry about that as much. Or are they going to try to use it against like an underground facility, like a bunker? Iran has underground facilities for its nuclear program, centrifuges, things like that. They claim they're for peaceful uses. The United States isn't sure, things like that. But you could imagine them saying, oh, a small nuclear weapon would destroy this underground facility. It would send a message. And the number of deaths, if the facility is isolated in the mountains or the desert or something, you'd kill the people who worked at the facility. And you might have some radiation downwind, but you wouldn't kill a lot of civilians. It wouldn't be like Hiroshima and Nagasaki where you have tens of thousands dead. And then lastly, you have a question of how high you set the bomb off. If the bomb is high in the air, it'll destroy a lot of like very light buildings, like houses. If you set it to go off underground or in the ground, you're going to mostly have that damage in a relatively limited area, but you're going to also create a lot more radiation.
So do you think this conversation about small bomb or a big bomb, mention of the smaller bomb, which may be used against the small area tanks or some facilities, is this one of the argument which is being used by different nuclear capable nations to sort of justify that a nuclear warfare is possible in a limited way?
Yes, explicitly. So this is, for me, also what I was going to say was, for me, the danger is that these little bombs on these underground facilities with very little collateral damage, the military is not going to be able to say no to that if they think it's a bad idea. It doesn't violate the American interpretation of the laws of war, the military interpretation. And it's going to be a much easier thing for a president to say yes to than destroy a whole city or destroy a whole country. And so this is what I fear most of all in terms of who's going to use nuclear weapons next. I don't actually think the North Koreans are that likely to use nuclear weapons. If Iran got them, I don't think they would be that likely to use them. What I worry about is as an American president being convinced by advisors or analysts that a little nuclear weapon is no big deal. And once you've done that, you've opened up a whole new box of, well, will the Russians feel the same way? How small is small? How containable is limited nuclear war? What if they use a little one and then we use a little one and they use a slightly bigger one? And I think that's actually very dangerous, totally avoidable, very scary situation, even though the initial use wouldn't look that different from a conventional attack. But I think it would open up a whole box of problems.
Thank you so much. You're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and Apple TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Professor Alex Welfstein, and we'll be right back to continue our conversations.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. Past campaigns covered a wide range of humanitarian concerns. Through Bosnia Task Force, imams and leaders of Chicago's Muslim community worked to ensure Bosnia became a top national issue. This led to life-saving American policies in Bosnia. A key accomplishment was helping to get rape declared a war crime. Initiatives also included Kosovo Task Force, Central African Republic Task Force, and Flint Coalition, which brought awareness to the water crisis affecting the people of Flint, Michigan. Highlights of our work include supporting Black Lives Matter, Parliament of the World Religions, addressing climate change.
So wasteful consumption starts the ruthless production, and that's where we need all the fossil fuel in the world.
And prominent media exposure.
This is Imam Malik Mujahid, President of Justice for All.
And I'm the Director of Outreach for Justice for All.
And that's why we need to go back to what worked.
Today we're demanding an apology from the CEO of Costco.
The Chinese crackdown on Uyghurs and other Turkic people has only gotten worse.
Current programs such as Burma Task Force advocate for the rights of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, internally displaced populations, and all those denied freedom of movement and at risk of starvation. Through this, we mobilized thousands of calls to elected representatives. This paved the way for the U.S. to increase funding for Rohingya refugees from $30 million to over $600 million. 2 of our documentaries were featured on international news outlets. The Rohingya People, A Slow-Burning Genocide on BBC World News, and Rohingya Refugees Tell of Massacre was featured on CNN. We've organized rallies, UN mission visits, expanded presentations on campuses, promoted research and report writing, outreach to think tanks, media, and other influencers. Faith Coalition educates about the Rohingya genocide and crimes against humanity faced by ethnic groups in Burma. We've traveled to refugee camps, convened a meeting of Karen, Kachin, and Rohingya leaders, both to encourage cooperation and to guide them in congressional outreach. We organized Rohingya Advocacy Day. This led to over 100 participants visiting the offices of 60 U.S. senators and congressional representatives. Free Kashmir advocates for the people of Kashmir. Long-term goals include the call for self-determination, the end of the Indian military's occupation of the territory, and raising awareness of Kashmiri issues among the American people. After the August 5th reinvasion of Kashmir, we organized national protests in front of various Indian government buildings, partnered with Stand With Kashmir, and launched a petition condemning the Gates Foundation's decision to present Prime Minister Modi a humanitarian award. Save Uyghur informs Muslims and neighbors of other faiths about the ongoing cultural genocide of Uyghur Muslims and mobilizes public support. Our projects include boycotting Chinese products with our Fast from China campaign, pushing Bill S-178 in the Senate, and organizing a nationwide protest of Costco. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Professor Alex Wellstein. We're talking from America and the danger of and the risk of that use of these atomic bomblets, if it could be used this term. What about India and Pakistan? I mean, in India, nationalism is rising to the level that, Hitler is a good guy, which is being, his books are taught at the universities there, in the business school. There are Hitler's Cafe and things like that. And fascism is appreciated, and Gandhi's killer is in power. On the other side, there's a Pakistan, which has lost, who have fought India and Pakistan 3 wars, and smaller country and relying on nuclear bomb, and as India has a nuclear bomb. And recently I was in Council Foreign Relations conversation, in which argument was that 2 nuclear powers can still engage in the traditional warfare. I guess the traditional warfare is a good war. I don't know about that, but so what is the real danger of nuclear war because of this consideration that limited nuclear war is possible, or 2 nuclear powers can still get into traditional warfare without using the nuclear bomb?
I think it's very dangerous and it's very troubling. India and Pakistan both have considerable nuclear arsenals at this point. They both have a lot of long-term animosity towards one another. I agree that the political direction of that, at least from what I've seen from the United States, and not an expert on these, but it's been disturbing. The rise of nationalism in India, is not a very welcome thing to see. Pakistan has traditionally felt vulnerable. And so the big worry that people have had is that if there is a conventional clash, if India looks like it's going to have too much of the upper hand on Pakistan, Pakistan would even the odds by using nuclear weapons. That would almost certainly have some sort of Indian response in kind. And now you're talking about the possibility of two nations right next to each other doing tremendous amounts of damage. The numbers of dead could be extremely high. These are both very dense populous nations. And the number, there are considerable worries about even the global consequences of this. If you burn as much material as these weapons could burn in an exchange, you can actually alter the climate. And this is, there's been some models for several years that have said that if you had a full exchange between the two, which is to say about a couple hundred nuclear weapons going off in the kinds of environments that they might be used, not only would you have probably uncountable dead, but you would potentially damage the climate enough globally that you would have famines globally. And you might have several years of climate damage that could kill, potentially even more people. So it's definitely not a welcome thing to see these countries once again in a state of very hostile, even overtly warlike relations. The fallacy of all of nuclear weapons is always that they can be controlled. And that's very dangerous.
Yes. You have written recently an article that asserts that no one really knows what is the actual number of people who died in Hiroshima Nagasaki. It's a very thorough article, and thank you so much bringing that. In the world where no one talks about the civilian casualties, somebody is still dwelling on that, I think is itself a reason to thank you for that. What is the bottom line? I mean, if you have to write in one line, what you're comfortable in writing in one line, how many people died?
If I had to write how many people died, what I would say is something like this. Now, I'm a wordy academic, so my one line can have many commas and semicolons and dashes and everything. But let's try to be very, very concise and pretend I have an editor working with me. Something along the lines of, in the 1940s, the United States government and its military estimated that the total dead at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was around 100,000 people total. We could split that up if we were using parentheses. It's about 60,000, 65,000 at Hiroshima, 35,000 at Nagasaki, thereabouts. Later reevaluations of this, however, led by a team of international scientists and by the Japanese themselves, concluded that many people were left out of that counting and instead put the number at more like 200,000. Which would be about 140,000 at Hiroshima and 70,000 at Nagasaki. Now that's one very long line. For me, the important thing to indicate is that it's two estimates. It's not one estimate and then more people died and we have a second estimate. These are two separate estimates. And one of them is made by the government, the United States government. And you can either think that's reliable or not, but it's important to say who did this. They did this as part of the occupation of Japan and their studying of the bombings. And the other is this later estimate done by independent scientists and the Japanese, which again, you can either give that more credit or not, depending on where you sit, on who you think would be more accurate. And that their argument is just essentially that people were left out. And one can read their reports and see exactly who they thought were left out. There were tens of thousands of Korean forced laborers, for example, at Hiroshima, who were not counted with the methodology of the original one. There are other groups who were in the city that day, commuters. Essentially, all of these calculations rely on how many people you think were in these cities at the time of the bombing. And that's very hard to know for a variety of reasons. The records weren't that good. The damage was extremely extensive. And it's all happening during World War II, where people kind of go missing or are hard to keep track of anyway.
So tell me that the John Wheelers, who was, the probably the leader of the U.S. research team over there, he was also a skeptic of the numbers which were presented, right?
There have been a lot of people who have presented skepticism. My favorite quote, there are some people who love the early estimates because they like them to be lower and they like that the Army came up with them and they think that makes them good estimates. And if you dig into it, they did an okay job. They really tried hard to get good numbers, but even those people admitted that it was just a guess. And they testified before Congress that you would think that, one of them said, I'm sorry to have to say this, but we tried our hardest, but it's just a guess. We cannot get firm numbers on this. No one is probably going to know exactly. And I think they did a good job. But when you look through how they made the estimate, the argument that they left people out is not at all implausible. The later people traced people who were sort of ignored at the time, including by the Japanese. The estimates they used were heavily based on sorts of official records where, say, Korean forced laborers don't show up in.
Yeah, because Koreans sort of were, unfortunately were dealt like as slaves,
yes,
and, captives, and probably less than human beings. So initially people found probably easy to just ignore them.
Right. And nobody was asking about them and nobody was keeping track of them. And there's a sort of deep message here, and one that applies in our current pandemic and all of that. But you don't get the numbers that you don't look for. And this is they weren't looking for those people and they didn't see them.
Well, John Hopkins seems to be mastering the art of counting numbers, which nobody wants to know. I mean, they did something in post-Iraq and Afghanistan, and they came up with a huge number of people. I think more than 1 million people who died in there, civilians, based on the probability theory based surveys. And so are there, I mean, they're the one who are giving out pandemic numbers also around the globe and things like that. But do you feel that overall, the peace movement or scientists who are concerned about these things are moving away from the thinking about the danger of nuclear warfare? I mean, you don't hear about that. I mean, Hiroshima Nagasaki bombing 75th anniversary provided another opportunity to talk about it a little bit. But I don't think, and I must admit, I don't have a full record of it, but I don't think televisions were showing any documentaries about that. I mean, this was not used an occasion for mass education on an issue like this, so critical for humanity. What if every what if scenario leads to a disastrous conclusion, except that not much education is out there. How do you feel about that?
We live in a time in which we have a lot of things to worry about. And I acknowledge that. It's not like you turn on the TV or read the news and it's rosy, positive, everything is great. We're all stuck inside our houses. We're all worried about the climate. We've got all sorts of big issues. I spend a lot of time talking with young people about what they worry about. And they worry about lots of things, and they're all good things to worry about. Social justice, the environment, now pandemic diseases, political corruption. There's a million things on their list. Nuclear weapons generally are not on their list anymore. And this is something that me and my colleagues have worked on a lot in talking about nuclear risks, and especially with younger generations. It's like after the 1990s, everybody sort of exhaled and said, well, we don't have to worry about nuclear weapons anymore. The Cold War is over. The weapons didn't go away, though. They're still there. And there are some very worrying trends in several countries. So I always say, if you have a list of things to worry about, you don't necessarily have to put nuclear weapons at number one. Some people do, and that's fine, but you don't have to put it at number one. Maybe you put climate change above there. Maybe you put some other things above there. That's fine. But it should be on your list because they're out there. And we like to think that everything is under very close control, but history shows us that's not the case. And certainly anything that looks at if you look around the world at the moment, you don't see a lot of control. You see a lot of things that are not really under much control at all.
So who do you think is pursuing a world without nuclear bombs? Is there anyone?
So there are some organizations that make this their major endeavor. Perhaps the most interesting one at the moment is known as ICAN, the International Coalition Against Nuclear Weapons. It's something like that. They have actually gotten a treaty written into the United Nations, signed by I think 40 countries, but you need 50 to make it a real. It's not in force, but it's a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. It says no nuclear weapons are allowed. And of course, no state with nuclear weapons has signed this treaty, but a lot of states have, and that's kind of surprising. And there are people who are in the arms control community who don't like this treaty at all because they think it undermines other treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and other efforts. But at the very least, it's an expression that many countries of the world, the non-nuclear ones, are very dissatisfied with the nuclear countries for not having pursued disarmament to the degree that they wish they had. But they're a very interesting group. They won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, Peace Prize, for their work. So they're doing a lot. I haven't seen. There's a lot of other interesting groups too, but they're the one who's gotten real something that looks like real results in the recent term.
So I think President Reagan said something similar to what President Obama also say, imagining or wondering or having a general vision of nuclear bomb-free world. Is that, U.S. seems to be sliding down when it comes to the international treaties or, a whole lot of human rights issues. Is there anyone in the world emerging to provide leadership in terms of national leadership or country leadership to still pursue a vision for a nuclear-free world?
None of the nuclear countries, to my knowledge, they're mostly, and there's some variance in this, but most of the nuclear weapons countries have been undergoing projects of improving their nuclear weapons over the last decade or so, and this includes the United States. There are some countries and some delegates, and again, connected with this treaty and organizations like that have really been trying to go to the nuclear weapons countries and say, you promised us when we signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, or whenever they, individual countries signed it, that you would, as an exchange for us not building nuclear weapons, you would get rid of your nuclear weapons. You would pursue meaningful disarmament over a meaningful period of time. And not just as an empty phrase, but you would really do it. And we don't feel you're really doing it anymore. And that might be something that is useful to say to the nuclear weapons states, because they benefit from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They don't want other nations to get nuclear weapons. They don't want to be sort of challenged in that respect. But they can only maintain their status as the only nuclear powers if other nations cooperate with them. There's some effort in this direction, but not led by the parties that rely on the nuclear states, or the nuclear states, which happen to be, some of the largest countries in the world.
Now, you pursue, you like to pursue the secrets of nuclear bombs and these technologies. So is it often that you discover a secret and let your class know in your, hey, today I discovered this?
So what I would always distinguish between, there are things that were once secret that are not legally binding anymore. And I have a lot of those. I have a lot of things that were former secrets. I don't try to get actively classified information, though occasionally you'll see something where somebody declassified something wrongly. Like, so let's say they'll have two documents and somebody will declassify document A one way and document B another way. And if you put together the two documents, you see the whole story. And I like pointing that out, not because you learn anything that interesting. The secrets, most secrets are very boring. One of the ones that I learned from one of these documents was that some specific method of making pipes at one of the uranium enrichment facilities had a tolerance of like 0.15 millimeters. That's the secret. Now that means nothing to me and will mean nothing to anyone else, and it won't help you make a nuclear weapon or anything like this. You need that information and so much others to actually use it. So there's a lot of things that are secrets that are not that interesting, or maybe are not that interesting unless you're working on something very specific.
Did you ever pursue a secret? I mean, it didn't hit many newspapers in America, but a wife murdered her husband because he was abusive, and it was somewhere in New England. And only Time magazine has a little story about that he even have different components of making a dirty bomb. He has ordered online some uranium and some of this and some of that, and only because of that murder, it was discovered that. So is there enough information out there that people are attempting to do things like this? Did you pursue that particular story?
I don't know of that story, no. There are stories, there is certainly enough information out there that somebody who wanted to do ill in the world could do it. And there's a million ways to do ill in the world. We've been fortunate that the ways in which people who have decided to do this have generally not involved nuclear things so far. They're harder to do than a truck full of ammonium nitrate, which is, again, similar to the Beirut. You don't need to know any secrets to know that ammonium nitrate and fuel oil are explosive. You can look it up on Wikipedia, and they're both pretty common techniques. I guess this is, if I were going to say one thing about the secrecy, one thing that's been questioned from 1945 onward is whether the secrecy actually keeps you safe. And there's a lot of reasons to think that it doesn't play that big of a role in why people don't do things. It isn't the secrecy that keeps a country from getting nuclear weapons. It isn't the secrecy that keeps terrorists from not getting them. It's a lot of other things, like not having access to certain metals or very hard to acquire materials, not information per se.
Well, thank you so much. You have been helpful in understanding a few more issues, although I thought you're going to share some secrets, but maybe next time and we'll invite you. Thank you so much, Professor Alex Bellerstein.
Really pleased to be here, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Dr. Abdul Wahid and Aliza Majid for producing today's show. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. You have been watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, Apple TV, as well as on our social media. We're always there on 24/7 on muslimnetwork.tv. Peace. Salam.